Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to dig into a pretty big piece of World War II history, and maybe turn it on its head a little. We're going on the hunt for a German armored vehicle that, I'm going to argue, was their most important one. And here's the twist. It's probably not the one you're thinking of.
Okay, so let me ask you, what was Germany's single most significant armored vehicle on the battlefield in World War II? Now, for most of us, right, the mind immediately jumps to those legendary big cats, the massive Tiger tank, maybe the sleek, deadly Panther. I mean, they're the superstars. They're in all the documentaries, all the video games. But what if I told you the real MVP, the true workhorse of the German armored forces, was something completely different? Yep, the answer isn't one of those famous high-tech monsters. Not at all. The vehicle that actually had the biggest strategic impact was, well, it was this humble, turretless machine that was never even supposed to be a tank killer in the first place. So, to really get why our unsung hero is so important, we first have to tackle what I like to call the myth of the super tank. We need to ask ourselves, why are we so obsessed with the Tiger and the Panther? And more importantly, what were their huge, critical flaws that almost always get overlooked? Okay, so this is what it all boils down to. On one hand, you've got the popular story, right? The Tiger and Panther tanks were the peak of German engineering, these unstoppable ultimate weapons. But then there's the surprising truth. And the truth, when you look at the actual data, is that a little assault gun called the Sturmgeschütz III, or Stug 3 for short, had a way bigger strategic impact. Now look, nobody's saying the Tiger and Panther weren't amazing pieces of tech. For sure, they were superior to most Allied tanks they faced. They had massive guns, super thick armor. They earned that fearsome reputation on the battlefield. But that is only half the story. The other half? Well, they were incredibly expensive to build, a mechanical nightmare, and they broke down a lot. And maybe the biggest problem of all, they were built in such tiny numbers that they were, strategically speaking, almost insignificant. They just couldn't be everywhere at once. And that right there brings us to the real workhorse of the German army. Because to see why the Stug 3 was so ridiculously important, you don't have to listen to me. You just have to look at the numbers. Okay, let's start with the legendary Tiger I. Over the entire course of the war, only 1,347 were ever built. I mean, think about that. For a tank with such a gigantic reputation, that's a shockingly small number. All right, now let's look at the Stug 3. Over 10,000 of them were rolled out. I mean, the difference is just staggering. You can immediately see the scale we're talking about here. The Stug wasn't some rare beast. It was everywhere. And that meant it could actually influence the course of battles on every single front all at once. Okay, now let's talk money, or Reichsmarks in this case. A single Tiger I tank cost around 300,000 Reichsmarks. That is a colossal amount of money and resources for a country in the middle of a world war. The Stug 3, just 82,500. Think about that for a second. That means for the price of one single Tiger, Germany could build almost 4 Stugs. In a long, brutal war of attrition, that kind of bang for your buck isn't just nice to have, it's an absolute game changer. What makes the Stug story so cool, really, is that it's a total underdog story. It was an accidental hero. This thing was never, ever designed to be Germany's #1 tank killer. No, its beginnings were way, way more humble than that. See, the Stug was originally designed as a Sturmgeschütz, which just means assault gun. The idea came from the hard lessons of World War I. Generals, especially a guy named Erich von Manstein, figured out that infantry on the attack needed their own armored fire support, something that could roll with them and blow up enemy bunkers and machine gun nests. So its job was to smash fortifications, not fight other tanks. And man, what a career it had. You can see it right here. The whole idea gets kicked off by von Manstein back in 1935. A couple years later, you've got the first prototypes built on the solid, reliable Panzer III chassis. By 1940, it's already in the fight in the Battle of France. And it just keeps going. It served on every front, right up until the very last days of the war in 1945. That just tells you how successful and adaptable this thing really was. So the big question is, how did this thing, this infantry support gun, turn into one of the most lethal tank destroyers of the war? Well, it boils down to a couple of really smart adaptations and some design quirks that turned out to be huge advantages. Let's dig into the Stug's secret weapons. The Stug's whole evolution was basically driven by pure desperation. See, it started out with this short, stubby gun, perfect for lobbing big explosive shells at concrete bunkers. But then, Germany invades the Soviet Union, and suddenly, they're running into the T-34 and the KV-1. And oh boy, that was a huge shock. So the Stug had to adapt, or it would have been useless. They slapped a much longer, high-velocity cannon on it, one that could punch right through enemy tank armor. And just like that, it had a new job. And here's the really ironic part. The Stug's biggest, most obvious weakness, the fact that it didn't have a turret, turned out to be its greatest strength. I know, it sounds crazy, but think about it. No complicated turret mechanism meant it was way cheaper and faster to manufacture. It was mechanically simpler, so it was more reliable and easier to repair in the field. And that low silhouette? It made it a tiny target for enemy gunners and made it absolutely perfect for hiding and setting up ambushes. Oh, and here's the kicker. Getting rid of the turret meant they could mount a much bigger, more powerful gun than the original Panzer III tank could ever hope to carry. It was a win-win-win. And because they built so many of these things, the Stug was, well, it was everywhere. I mean, this here is just a tiny snapshot. But look, you've got Stug units on the Eastern Front getting wiped out in the horror of Stalingrad. You've got them in Italy fighting the Allies tooth and nail, up on the Western Front trying to stop the paratroopers at Arnhem. And they were still there, right at the very end, fighting in the rubble during the battle for Berlin. It truly was the backbone of the German army, especially in those later defensive years. Which brings me to what might be the single most mind-blowing statistic about this vehicle. Now, these numbers are always tough to verify perfectly, but the German assault gun crews were credited with an absolutely insane number of kills. Some estimates claim that by the end of the war, the Stug alone was responsible for destroying something like 30,000 Soviet tanks. Let me say that again, 30,000. That's more than any other German fighting vehicle, period. 30,000. Just let that number sit for a second. That wasn't the work of the famous Tiger or the Panther. That was the incredible impact of this humble assault gun. A vehicle that was cheap, reliable, and, this is the most important part, it was there. It was on the battlefield in massive numbers right when it was needed the most. So where does that leave us? What's the final verdict on our unsung hero? Well, when you lay out all the evidence, a really clear picture starts to form about what actually makes a weapon system important in a massive war like this. You know, it really all comes down to this. The Tiger was, without a doubt, a technological marvel. But it was just too little, too late. The Stug III, on the other hand, was a masterpiece of, well, of practicality. It was the champion in the three categories that actually win long wars. It was cost-effective, it was reliable, and you could build a whole lot of them. And that's really the key lesson here, isn't it? The most important weapon isn't always the biggest or the most famous one. It's almost never the most powerful one, on paper. More often than not, it's the one that's just there, the one that's dependable, affordable, and shows up in large enough numbers to actually change the game. The Stug III was the perfect example of that. And it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other unsung heroes are out there in history? You know, in science, in technology, even in art. The real workhorses that have been completely overshadowed by the more famous, flashy legends. How many other stories are there of the show horse getting all the credit while the workhorse did all the heavy lifting? It's something to think about. Thanks for joining me.